Black Power. We got one viewer. What's up? How you doing? Good morning to you.
Good
Happy
morning.
Sunday.
Good morning. Okay. I should get this notification here in a minute. You?
I feel like I had a burp, you know. There you go. Excuse me. It's morning. Ooh. The one viewer went away. Damn.
No.
What? Is it
You
up?
can't have that.
Oh. Yes, come back to us. Come back. It's morning. I don't know why I keep singing that song.
You said we were singing it last week.
I know, right?
Okay, here come Robert.
Maybe because I was sleeping with somebody.
Black Power Robert.
Black Power Comrade Robert. What's up, y'all? Make sure when you come in that you share the link to this video. Put hashtag shared in the comments when you have shared it. Let's share the Revolutionary Book Trap with all our friends and families. Yeah, because you know some of y'all got more than one family out here in these streets. But I ain't gonna put y'all business out there like that. Good morning, Black Power Comrade Robert, Vinny. How are you? Let's build the audience. So we can go ahead and get started. What's up, Cameron? Cameron, what's up? Cameron, what's... You got a pink fur. What's up, Comrade Muhammadu? Black Power.
Black Power, y'all. Black Power. Make sure y'all share.
Yes, share.
All of your pages, each and every one of them.
Okay. I know the groups I be in, these people be sick of me because every time we go live with our public meeting, the book trap, I share it, and you know how you have to get a notification, like if they allow you to post the video.
Yeah.
I never get a notification. But I just keep sharing it anyway. I don't care. Thank you for sharing, Comrade Robert. What's up, Comrade Alex? Thank you for sharing, Comrade Muhammadu. All right, y'all. So we got enough people in the room. Welcome to the Revolutionary Book Trap with your boy, Chiefs Dia.
Chiefs Nyah. In this motherfucker.
Period. Welcome, y'all. It is again another Sunday, another beautiful Sunday. Don't forget to tune into the Revolutionary Book Trap every Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time right here from the Revolutionary Black Hammer Facebook page and soon to be the Revolutionary Book Trap podcast. Woo, 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 woo. So first we want to give a shout out to our wonderful donors. And, you know, can y'all comment on the sound quality? How does it sound this morning? Because we were able to order our mic. Black Power. So, you know, we're trying to make sure the quality of the sound is sounding good. So, you know, when we convert over to the podcast, you know, you can tell the sound difference. Wait, Comrade Muhammadu says, I'm blocked from sharing in these groups till April. Damn.
Who did you piss off, Muhammadu?
Comrade Robert Vinny says, Facebook only lets me share to like 7 pages now. Oh, crisp clear. We sounded crispy. This morning. Okay.
That's what's up.
But anyway, yes, you can tune in to the Revolutionary Book Trap starting February 21st. Okay?
Oh my God.
So right now, the Political Education and Culture Command, we are working on, putting together the account with our audio boom account. So that way you can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. We'll be on Spotify. We'll be on Radio 1, iHeart. Like all the major platforms. Like this shit is big.
I mean, we're unstoppable. We're just unstoppable.
And not only will you have the Revolutionary Book Trap, but you will also have Propaganda, which is led by Comrade Chief Robert. And if you've tuned into Propaganda is a show that basically analyzes, different media, like, well, not different, well, yeah, different media.
shows and
Yeah,
media and,
like different
yeah.
popular shows that you see. I believe Comrade Robert has done anime. He's done, what's the show called that's real popular on Netflix?
Oh, the Stranger Things.
Stranger Things. He's done movies. Like, you know what, Comrade Chief Robert, if you watching this, you have to do Sex Education on Netflix. You have got to analyze that show. And it was another suggestion that I have for you as well too. But yeah, you need to Conrad, I know you will go in on that show because it's crazy. Ooh, somebody said, "Hey, handsome. Hey, beautiful."
Who is that? I think it's Sid.
That's Sid.
That's Sid.
Oh, Sid. This is our first time seeing Sid in like some weeks now, right? We ain't seen you.
MIA.
What's up with that, Sid?
Black Power Kendrick. Thank you for joining us.
Black Power, yes, y'all. So we got our conference call set up too, just in case people don't have this ugly blue app or whatever. So yes, podcast coming soon. Keep your eyes open for that. Boom, y'all. All right, y'all. You got any other announcements coming right now?
I do.
Okay, go ahead.
So the California Black Hammer chapter will be having their self-defense workshop.
Yes.
In Stanford Avenue Park. The donations can be taken at $ Cali Hammers.
Cali Hammers. Ooh.
This is going to include...
I like the name of that.
I know. And then they're going to include instruction on self-defense and the proper use of pepper sprays.
Yes.
So that's going to be the thing. And then Saturday, February the 29th, 12 noon to 3 p.m., there's going to be a protest for the Brandon Survived hashtag for Sir Brandon Leggett, who was... shot in the back of the head by the South Carolina Pigs.
Yes.
And so that's going to be taking place on Saturday, February the 29th. I do believe they will be taking donations, but we don't have a cash app just yet. Mm-hmm. And we also will be releasing more information about the petition as well. So
Black Power. So yeah, if you guys aren't familiar with the hashtag Brandon Survived story, right now Black Hammer is in the middle of this very powerful and profound campaign right now, and I just really want to express appreciation to Brandon's mother, who reached out to Black Hammer, as an organization to help her with this case, to take this case on. And so pretty much the story goes, there's this African brother from Columbia, South Carolina, who in August of last year was pretty much attacked and shot by the pigs. One pig, namely being Sean Rollins, and they shot him twice, execution style. Like one bullet grazed him, and then the other went through his skull, and it passed like through his skull, like the tissue, and came out of his temple. And so this happened at like maybe 2:30 in the morning, where these pigs pulled up on Brandon at his job. At a Food Lion, and behind the store where he worked, they pretty much dragged him there. They took him out of the car. They beat him first. First they beat him, and then they shot him. And so, we understand that this story is pretty similar to so many other things that we see happening to our African brothers and sisters, our colonized brothers and sisters. Mm-hmm. And, what makes this case so nuanced and so different is the fact that Brandon did survive.
To tell about it.
To tell about it. And even at the point to where Brandon was on the ground after he had been shot, the officers thought he was dead. They thought he had died. But he was actually able to hear them concocting the lie that they were going to tell to the rest of the pig force to cover up what had happened. Like the pig even jumped into his car, tried to put tire marks in the parking lot. He had one of the other pigs like rough up his clothes. And when the ambulance got there, he laid on the ground. Like he laid on the ground as if he was attacked. But, just like Comrade Nyah just said, the difference, between this case and, what we saw happen to our sister Sandra Bland, to Tamir Rice, to Mike Gardner, like all of these other innocent African brothers and sisters and colonized brothers and sisters who have been murdered. Brandon was conscious, and he can tell us what has happened to him. So please, please, please visit the Black Hammer website. Go to the petition. If you haven't signed the petition, please sign the petition. If you are in Columbia, South Carolina, the protest is happening February 29th. You can look up the event information on the Black Hammer Facebook page. And please, if you can, come out and attend this event.
Muhammadu, if you are still on live stream, please drop the petition in the comments if you can, please.
Yes, so please, Comrade Muhammadu.
Yes.
All right, comrades. Black Power. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so we're ending the chapter 4 in How Africa, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by our brother Walter Rodney. Excuse me. And our reading assignment, I don't know what's going on. So our reading assignment for this show was from the coming of imperialism into chapter 5 up until the shipping and banking services. Yep. So we're beginning with the subtitle, The Coming of Imperialism and Colonialism. And before we start this conversation, like up until this point, we've been discussing pretty much the 14th century all the way up until the 18th century. So yeah, so we're talking about the coming of imperialism and colonialism. So at this point, we're entering the 19th century. Riley says, I just jumped into this and heard protest on the 29th. Columbia. Yes, Riley, there is a protest that's happening for our hashtag Brandon Survived campaign. Pretty much it's based around this African brother by the name of Brandon, who was shot twice by the pigs in Columbia, South Carolina, but he survived. And so we're working on this campaign, to put out the story, to spread the word and things of that nature. And so, yeah, we'll be on the ground February 29th organizing a protest. So if you are in Columbia, South Carolina, please come out and attend and, help us spread the story. And I would invite you to, just rewatch the video so you can get a full summation of, everything that's going on. But, so we're entering the 19th century. So during this period, like the slave trade is pretty much like dying out at this point. And so now what Europeans are doing is they're trying to consolidate, well, not really consolidate their economy, but what they're trying to do is get access to surplus. So right now, the Europeans, being that they're, like the British and I believe the French had pretty much made like the slave trade in their countries like obsolete, because they saw that, first of all, it was hindering, their economy. So they had to turn to the resources, the raw resources that they came across in Africa. And a lot of this conversation around imperialism and colonialism, as Walter Rodney is going to lay out in this portion of the chapter, what we saw in the pre-colonial area before imperialism and colonialism, became a stable in Africa. He speaks to pretty much the seeds that had already been planted in order to bring colonialism and imperialism into fruition and, to fully enact it here in Africa. And he named so many different things, such as the slave trade, the trade with Europeans in general, and then how they had, he didn't outright call them like neocolonialists, but the Africans at this time who had become agents for the Europeans at this point in time. So let's go ahead and get into it. So starting with, first he starts with asking the question, how did Africa and Europe become combined in capitalist imperialism? So he says that a qualitative change was happening to Europe's economy, and this is because they were making use, he says making use, but we pretty much know that they were going around the world murdering, the indigenous people of, different countries and stealing their resources and things of that nature. And he also makes the point where he says, where does he say it? Okay, So to elucidate the main thesis of the study, it is necessary to follow not only the development of Europe and the underdevelopment of Africa, but also to understand how those two combined in a single system, that of capitalist imperialism. And he also says that, okay, so right now we're pretty much dealing with this time where Europe's economy is just growing, it's growing and growing and growing and growing. And he says that there are many qualitative change in the European economy, which accompanied and made possible by the increase in the quantity of goods. For example, machines and factories rather than land provided the main source of wealth, and labor had long since ceased to be organized on a restricted family basis. The peasantry had been brutally destroyed, and the labor of men, women, and children was ruthlessly exploited. Those were the great social evils of the capitalist system. So right now in Europe, the main source of wealth that they have at this point is basically coming from the factories and things of that nature. So now that feudalism has died out in Europe, now they're going into the machinery and things of that nature. So you got to understand, like, there's this whole big, like, gap of time. So he says that the Portuguese sailed to West Africa in 1444 was a huge gap by the time the European Robert Statesman sat down in Berlin 440 years later to decide who would steal which parts of Africa. Now, here's the point. It was that gap which provided both the necessity and the opportunity for Europe to move into the imperialist epoch and to colonize and further underdeveloped Africa. So pretty much from that time, like he says, from 1444 up until the Berlin Conference, Europe had already been prepping itself for the colonial domination of Africa. And he even says, even at this point, the Europeans didn't even understand, like, what exactly was happening in terms of, like, colonizing Africa. So he also makes mention of the technological and economic gaps between Western Europe and Africa, and, which he says even became a trend, which pretty much put Europe in permanent wealth and Africa in permanent poverty. So, yeah.
So basically, I mean, what I took away from that was just that Europe's development totally dependent on, Europe's overdevelopment depended on making Africa totally dependent on it in order for it to gain any type of goods into Africa or any type of income into Africa. It had to make Africa completely dependent on it. And I just this section and everything like that really outlined the horrible work conditions and really just the explicit exploitation. It's really disgusting.
And then it's
I mean,
so just understanding, like, how Europe is operating at this time. So because they were able to exploit, like, Africa in such a way as described by Chief Nyah, this is what provided the basis for Europe to create, like, these businesses and institutions. And you got to understand, like, this happened like 400 plus years ago, and those same institutions exist today. And so he pretty much outlines, like, how these, he calls them firms, which were able to create a monopoly, like, on certain aspects, on certain aspects of the economy in Europe. And he says, European monopoly firms operated by constantly fighting to gain control over raw materials, markets, and means of communications. They also fought to be the first to invest in new profitable undertakings related to their line of business, whether it be inside or outside their countries. So that means not only were they, out committing genocide, like, all around the world, they were fighting internally to have access to these different types of resources. And he continues to say, indeed, After the scope of expansion became limited inside their national economies, their main attention was turned to those countries whose economies were less developed and who would therefore offer little or no opposition to the penetration of foreign capitalism. The penetration of foreign capitalism on a worldwide scale from the 19th century onward is what we call imperialism.
Yeah.
So
just forcing, itself, the rule of trade. And, he's already established how the trade laws and rules were established from the Europeans from the very beginning. So they set the prices and everything. And then that rule is being forced literally all over the planet.
All over the planet. And he goes on to even further say, it meant that European, North American, and Japanese, and remember Japanese they colonizers too.
Exactly.
I don't know how quietly kept it is, but a lot of people don't really understand that. Yeah. Capitalists were forced by the internal logic of their competitive system to seek abroad in less developed countries opportunities to control raw material supplies, to find markets, and to find profitable fields of investment. So even with that understanding, we have to understand that Africa, even though they were, committing genocide and, stealing all of these raw materials in different areas around the world, Africa operated as the base. So understanding that the prototype for the genocide, for the colonization that we see within the world, Africa was pretty much like the experimentation ground. Like they had to carry out they started these policies in Africa and then carried them out into the rest of the world. So even as they're doing all of this, Africa is still operating as that base of, just like, like an experiment of how they will colonize the rest of the world.
And on top of that, this is what, again, they keep saying, well, Africa is just this big, huge desert and everything like that, but that's not true because, the reason why they did it over there was because of all the resources. You got rubber, you got cotton, you got groundnuts, you have all these things that is made a profit in all these machines that the Europeans have set up. They're using those raw materials, turning it into these refined materials, selling them at these horrible prices, and so it's profitable for them to be there in Africa in this large desert, supposedly.
Exactly. And then we have a comment by Abhishek. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Trapper. And just so y'all know, we call people who watch the Revolutionary Book trappers. So y'all trappers, okay? And he says, even India contributed to the development of Europe. And that is so true. That is so true. So so later on in the chapter, he speaks about how Europeans often derive moral justification for imperialism and colonialism from features of the international trade as conducted up to the eve of colonial rule in Africa. The British were the chief spokesmen for the view that the desire to colonize was largely based on their good intentions and wanting to put a stop to the slave trade. Oh, wow. Now listen to how they try to spin this, okay? Therefore, slaving was rejected insofar as it had become a fetter on further capitalist development. So this didn't mean that they were ending slavery because of some moral sense. They were ending slavery because slavery had become a constraint on how they could, expand capitalistically. Yeah. If that's a word.
We'll take it.
Yeah, we're going to take it. So he says, this was particularly true of East Africa, where Arab slaving persisted until late in the 19th century. The British took special self-righteous delight in putting an end to Arab slave trading and in disposing of rulers on the ground that they were slave traders. So not only did the British and so many other European, nations come into Africa and start the slave trade. Now they are condemning the same agents that they set up to propagate the slave trade. And now they come down with the moral hammer to say the slave trade is wrong.
I mean, the hypocrisy of it all.
It's absolutely disgusting. And he makes another point by saying King Leopold II of Belgium also used the anti-slavery excuse to introduce into Congo forced labor and modern slavery. Besides, all Europeans had derived ideas of racial and cultural superiority between the 15th and 19th centuries while engaged in genocide and the enslavement of non-white peoples. Even Portugal, listen to this shit.
Right.
Listen to this shit. Even in Portugal, an impoverished and backward European nation in the imperialist era could still presume that it had a destiny to civilize the natives in Africa.
The only true proletariat is the colonized proletariat. Even the poorest European nations still exploited the African nation. It's right here. Wow.
And here's another large point that Brother Walter makes. And it speaks to, how Europe's colonization of Africa, just all of these different things that we see like taking place during the pre-colonial era in Africa in terms of the slave trade and just the early trading that we saw between Africans and Europeans and how Europeans were bringing over to Africa these rundown, pretty much useless items to have trade. And just how this whole thing is to say that without the colonization of Africa somehow would not have been able to survive or to be introduced to civilization. When obviously, if it wasn't for Africa and our resources and our people, there would be no Europe. There would be no Europe. There would be no European identity. Let's make that clear. There would be no concept of a white man or a white woman. And even we could even speak more to that. And this is what he says. Y'all listen to this because this is some powerful shit. There is a curious interpretation of the scramble in African partition which virtually amounts to saying that colonialism came about because of Africa's needs rather than those of Europe. Africa, they say, required European colonization if it were to advance beyond the stage it had reached in the late 19th century. Clearly, they do not appreciate that such a line of reasoning was suggesting that Africa would develop if it were given bigger doses of the European concoction that had already started its underdevelopment, that it would develop if it lost the last remnants of its freedom of choice, which had clearly been seriously undermined by the pre-colonial trade, that it would develop if its economy became more integrated with Europe's own terms that were entirely dictated by Europe. Those implications and their fallacies would be plain to anyone who tries to understand the development process before making the pronouncements on any particular epoch of human development in Africa. Wow. So you're trying to tell me that Europe colonization of Africa is pretty much
the best thing that ever happened to you. Basically, Africa is in the best state it could ever possibly be at because of the havoc, the genocide that was inflicted on the continent. This is the best thing that happened to this continent, was its interaction with Europe. And the development not only benefited Europe, which of course it did, but it also benefited Africa, which they still have yet to demonstrate how, because Africa was already in its own period of development when its own population started to stagnate because of the slave trade. Yeah, wow.
Let's read some of the comments, because that's Comrade Tariva saying,
well,
woo,
Alex is
the lies.
They hot, girl. Alex said, it's why I hate Eli Whitney so much. American slavery would have ended 50 years earlier if not for his cotton gin, which kept the slave economy profitable for another half century. Diva said, they try to make it seem like they wanted to, quote, end slavery out of some noble cause when it really was about making more money.
Exactly.
Which is basically the same thing that happened around the Civil War in the U.S. It wasn't about, these are humans. Let's, it was, it's obsolete, and now it's become less profitable for us to do that.
Let's throw this in here, too. Not only the Civil War, but the Civil Rights Movement as well.
You mean ending segregation? Where they,
in the industrialization of the North, and how they wanted to get rid of segregation so they could bring workers, so they can bring Africans out of the South into the North to work the West.
And the West. As a matter of fact, Huey Newton, didn't he talk about that in his book, where there was a community out there where there were several African people that had been completely disregarded, disposed of, and unemployed after they had basically completed a job, and they couldn't find jobs anywhere else. This is the same. It happens every day. It's still a continuous cycle. Wow. You mean history actually repeats itself?
And then, you know what, Comrade? I wouldn't even say that history is repeating itself. It's just the same motherfucking history that we see that Brother Walter Rodney is talking about right now. But what you're seeing is the maturity of the same history. You're seeing the new ways being introduced to the different systems that were put into place by Europe, and how how it's modernized. So it's not even a matter of history repeating itself. It's the same old history, but the tactics, the same, and then even at the most simplest, it's still the same methods, but now they've been able to put a black face on it, or they've been able to put a liberal face on it, or they've been able to put, all these different nuances to put on it to confuse and debase us as colonized people. But Black Hammer is here to dispel all of that shit. So yeah. So continuing on in the chapter, so he then Brother Walter Rodney begins to speak to how African rulers at this time, who were also trying to branch out and trade, not only with Europe, but to make contact with other countries as well too. And for example, he says in 1850, the reigning Dahomean king Gezo proclaimed an edict whereby all young oil palms were to be freed from parasites surrounding them, and severe penalties were imposed for cutting palm trees. Gezo, who ruled from 1818 to 1857, was a reformer, and he made sincere efforts to meet criticisms of his policies by groups such as missionaries and anti-slavery campaigners. But it soon became clear that the Europeans were not bent on seeing Dahomey reemerge as a strong state, but were rather creating excuses in the subjective conditions to justify their proposed colonization of the people of Dahomey. Under those circumstances, the last Dahomean monarch, Jele, I think I'm pronouncing that right, fell back on his capital at Abomey and pursued the policies which he considered most consistent with the dignity and independence of the hominy. Gel raided Abeokuta, which contained converts who were already British, so-called British protected persons. He told the French to get the hell out of Porto Novo, and he generally resisted until defeated militarily by the French in 1889. So again, we even see that the African rulers at this point they're trying to break this relationship that they had, not that they had, but the relationship that was forced upon them by Europeans. And he says African groups who had little or nothing to do with slave exports also intensified their efforts to integrate into a wider world in the 19th century. So we were still trying to make efforts to break this relationship that we have been pulled into by Europeans.
I mean, this is, and then I like at the bottom of this page where he goes into like the Egyptians and how they were even trying to further their own interests. The ideals of Muhammad Ali could be related in the idiom of modern social sciences being a creation of viable, self-propelling economy to provide a basis for national independence. Such ideals were diametrically opposed to the needs of European capitalism.
Even that point right there. Even Egypt as the example is being used.
Yes.
Even for Egypt to want to branch out for any country for any area in Africa to want to branch out in its own system of trade. I mean, it wasn't possible. It could not have been possible because, as he said, it's diametrically opposed to the needs of European capitalism.
It's like oil and water. You can't serve the two interests. It's one goes the other way. It says British and French industrialists wanted to see Egypt not as a textile manufacturer, but as a producer of raw cotton for export. They wanted to keep them in a position of dependency. You produce this raw, you grow this crop. We're going to pay you pennies for it. We're going to turn this into what we need it to, and we're going to sell it for our own profit.
And in Egypt, as Rodney is making an example, they were trying to keep the raw cotton in Egypt, manufacture it themselves to create products to keep in Egypt. But Europe wanted them to maintain, as you said, they just wanted you to grow the cotton, then you send the cotton to Britain. And then Britain makes the manufacture. They manufacture the goods, and then they sell it back to you.
Absolutely. They don't want you making your own shit. That's a no-no. European financiers wanted Egypt to become a source of investment, and for the second half of the 18th century, they turned the Sultan of Egypt into an international beggar who mortgaged the whole of Egypt to international monopoly financiers. Finally, European statesmen wanted Egyptian soil to serve as a base for exploiting India and Arabia. Therefore, the Suez Canal was dug out of Egyptian soil by Egyptians, but that was owned by Britain and France, who then extended political domination over Egypt and Sudan.
And here's another point, This is how we understand and how we can say, like, Africa, without the liberation of Africa as a continent, the rest of the world will never ever be free. Will never ever be free. And I say that because all of the oppression that the world is experiencing at this point, all of the imperialism, all of the colonialism, first of all, has its basis on African soil. And just so y'all don't think I'm just saying this shit out of my head because this is how I feel, but it's backed by historical fact. And to make that point even more clear, Walter Rodney says, however, European capitalists came to the decision that Africa should be directly colonized. But hold on, even before I get there, he says, in many parts of the world, capitalism in its imperialist form accepted that some measure of political sovereignty should be left in the hands of the local population, meaning that in certain countries where we did see Europeans committing colonialism and imperialism, they left some of that power in the hands of the local population. So you understand that. So even like, for example, in India or in China, like they still had some control over their governmental features, over their political features. So it wasn't even I don't even feel right saying this, but even though it wasn't a complete colonization, they still had some type of access to autonomy. So this was so in Eastern Europe, in Latin America, and to a more limited extent in China. However, European capitalists came to the decision that Africa should be directly colonized. There is evidence to suggest that such a course of action was not entirely planned. Britain and France up until the 1850s and 1860s would have preferred to divide Africa into informal spheres of influence. That means that there would have been a gentleman's agreement that, say, Nigeria would be exploited by the British merchants while Senegal would be exploited by Frenchmen. At the same time, both Englishmen and Frenchmen would trade in a minor way in each other's informal empire. But firstly, there were disagreement over who would suck which pieces of Africa, especially since Germany wanted to join the grabbing. And secondly, the moment that one European power declared an area in Africa as a protectorate or a colony, it put up tariffs against European traders of other nationalities, in turn forced their rivals to have colonies and discriminatory tariffs. One thing led to another, and soon 6 European capitalist nations were falling over each other to establish direct political rule over particular sections of Africa. Make no mistake about it, gentlemen like Carl Peter, Livingstone, Stanley, Harry Johnson, de Brazza, General Gordon, and their masters in Europe were literally scrambling for Africa. They barely avoided a major military conflagration. That meant these motherfuckers was about to go to war over Africa.
Over it. Like, there is no discussion about the needs of these people here. They're competing with each other of who's going to dominate it and profit off of it.
And to even make the goal, even to make that point even more clear, as far as Africa is concerned, Englishmen violently opposed black self-government, such as the Fante Confederation on the Gold Coast in the 1960s. They also tried to erode the authority of black Creoles in Sierra Leone. In 1874, when Fora Bay College sought and obtained affiliation with Durham University, which is a European university, the Times, y'all know the Times, the magazine that's still existing today, the Times newspaper declared that Durham should next affiliate with the London Zoo.
Y'all, if y'all have some read that bags, please put them in the comments section. We really want to hear what y'all have to say about all of this. This is some really...
We're going to move into we're going to go ahead and move into chapter 5, but also, so first of all, we're just looking at how Europe was moving, as capitalists in terms of, implementing colonization and imperialism in Africa. And again, how, the pre-colonial era, had already set the basis for what was coming. But what Comrade Walter Rodney sums up in the rest of the chapter leading into chapter 5 is the Negro ass sellout. The Negro ass sellout. And at this point, he doesn't name them as, neo-colonialists or the petty bourgeoisie as we understand them to be now. But this is what he's pretty much speaking to.
Right.
And he says, colonialism flourished rapidly from a European viewpoint because several of its features were already rooted in Africa in the preceding period. One of the most decisive features of the colonial system was the presence of Africans serving as economic, political, and cultural agents of European colonialists. So pretty much the bootlicker sellouts. Yep. Even in the 18th, 15th, 19th, 16th century. Mm-hmm. Yep. Those agents or comparadors were already serving European interests in the pre-colonial period. The impact of trade with Europe had reduced many African rulers to the status of middlemen for European trade. It had raised ordinary Africans to that same middleman commercial role, and it had created a new trading group of mixed blood, the children of European or Arab fathers. Those types can all be referred to as comparadors, and they played a key role in extending European activity from the coast into the hinterland as soon as Europeans thought of taking over political power. One outstanding example of the above is the way the French colonialists used Africans and mulattoes on the Senegalese coast as agents for the spread of French control of thousands of miles into areas now covered by Senegal, Mali, Chad, Upper Volta, and Niger. Those particular blacks and mulattoes were living in the trading ports of Gorée, Dakar, St. Louis, and Rufisque, and they had long standing links with Atlantic trade. Here's another example. Africans conducting trade on behalf of Europeans were not merely commercial agents, but also cultural agents, since inevitably they were heavily influenced by European thought and values. The search for European education began in Africa before the colonial period. Coastal rulers and traders recognized the necessity to penetrate more deeply into the way of life of the white man who came across the sea. The mulatto sons of white traders and the sons of African traders were the ones who made the greatest effort to learn the white man's ways. This helped them to conduct business more efficiently. And this is so fucking disgusting. One Sierra Leone ruler in the 18th century explained that he wished to learn books to be rogue as good as white men. And there were many others who saw the practical advantages of literacy. However, the educational process also meant imbibing values which led to further African subjugation. One West African educated in this early period wrote a PhD thesis in Latin justifying slavery. That was not surprising. The Reverend Thomas Thompson was the first European educator on the Gold Coast, and he wrote in 1778 a pamphlet entitled "The African Trade of Negro Slaves Shown to be Consistent with the Principles of Humanity and the Laws of Revealed Religion."
Oh, that sounds like Christianity. I mean, to get the world to go along with it, you've got to find a way to justify it so it doesn't sound like just pure D barbarism. Yeah. And they've got to make the subjects believe that it's true. Wow.
I think we have a Read That Back by Comrade Alex. Let's read that before we jump into chapter 5.
Let's do that. The Alex says the mulatto sons of white traders and the sons of African rulers were the ones who made the greatest efforts to learn the white ways. You still see this trend with the gen children of the immigrants to be most likely to accumulate college debt and integrate better way to pay off the debt. Black power. Yep.
Black power, y'all. So we're gonna go ahead. Did you have anything else to mention before we move on to chapter 5?
No, you pretty much summed that
The
up.
last thing I wanted to read before going into chapter 5 is the last paragraph of chapter 4, where he says, "It is widely accepted that Africa was colonized because of its weakness. The concept of weakness should be understood to embrace military weakness and inadequate economic capacity, as well as certain political weaknesses, namely the incompleteness of establishment of nation states, which left the continent divided, and the low level of consciousness concerning the world at large, which had already been transformed into a single system by the expansion of capitalist relations."
And I did have something else highlighted at the top of that page. It says many African rulers sought a European alliance to deal with their own African neighbor whenever they were in conflict. So they had even been taught that they couldn't resolve their own conflicts, and they needed to involve the colonizers in the middle of their affairs. And of course, those conflicts were never resolved in a way that was going to benefit the African nations. It was always going to benefit the relations of the trade with the European.
Exactly. All right, y'all. So we're going to go ahead and move into chapter 5, which is entitled Africa's Contribution to the Capitalist Development of Europe, the Colonial Period. And so he starts off with the subtitle. It says, Expatriation of African surplus under colonialism, capital, and African wage labor. So now we're going to talk about how, so colonialism and imperialism has completely has gone into full effect in Africa. So now what we're going to take a look into is the early development of African wage labor in the continent. So this is speaking to, the mining that we see taking place today, to the different plantations, the farming that we see taking place today, and even the wages that have not changed. That literally have not changed from this period that we're talking about. We're talking about like the early 19th century all the way up until now to 2020.
Okay, people still live on that exact same wage.
The same wage. The same wage. And what we have to understand right now is he starts off by saying colonial Africa fell within the part of the international capitalist economy from which surplus was drawn to feed the metropolitan sector. So any type of surplus of resources, not even surplus, but just the natural resources in Africa that was there from the beginning of time, was used to feed Europe and other European nations. So we're literally watching Africa being transformed into this type of bank of what you see like Europeans just extracting from. Just
like a large warehouse.
Yes. And he says from an African viewpoint, that amounted to consistent expatriation of surplus produced by African labor out of African resources. It meant the development of Europe as a part of the same dialectical process in which Africa was underdeveloped. By any standards, labor was cheap in Africa, and the amount of surplus extracted from the African laborer was great. The employer under colonialism paid an extremely small wage, a wage usually insufficient to keep the worker physically alive. So this means that Africans, even today, aren't making a wage that can keep them alive. That can keep them alive.
To feed themselves, yeah. Sustain. And again, who set those wages?
Europe set those wages. Europe set those wages.
Oh, and we about to get to some other stuff because we're going to compare. Okay. So it's not that they couldn't pay them.
And then he even speaks to, people like these delusional ass people like to speak to the white working class and all of this bullshit. He says, after feudalism in Europe had ended, the worker had absolutely no means of sustenance other than through the sale of his labor to capitalists. Therefore, to some extent, the employer was responsible for ensuring the physical survival of the worker by giving him a living wage. In Africa, this was not the case. Europeans offered the lowest possible wage and relied on legislation backed by force to do the rest. The colonial state had a monopoly of political power after crushing all opposition by superior armed force. Secondly, the African working class was small, very dispersed, and very unstable owing to migratory practices. I think that's how you pronounce it. Yeah. European capitalists in Africa had additional racial justification for dealing unjustly with the African worker. Go ahead, comrade. Speak about these wages.
Yeah, so these wages, right? So we were like, the labor is not worth that much and everything like that. So he goes on to talk about the racist theory that the black man was inferior, that he deserved lower wages, and that it says that interestingly enough, the light-skinned Arab and Berber populations of North Africa were treated as blacks by the white racist French. The combination of the above factors in turn made it extremely difficult for African workers to organize themselves. So even at this point, it's almost like a train that you're not going to be able to stop. Mm-hmm. It's in full force. They have all the guns, they have all the resources and all the wealth. There's no way for Africa to stop this moving train to even, do anything about it. Mm-hmm. But the wages, where he says wages paid to workers in Europe and North America were much higher than wages paid to African workers in comparable categories. The Nigerian coal miner at Enugu earned 1 shilling per day, which I didn't equate that to the American dollar to just for context, but 1 shilling per day for working underground and 9 pence per day for jobs on the surface. Such a miserable wage would be beyond the comprehension of a Scottish or German coal miner who would virtually earn in an hour what the Enugu miner was paid for a 6-day week. They get that per hour. Per hour.
And then he also says that to justify these wages, he says that the standard and cost of living was higher in capitalist countries. The fact is that the higher standard was made possible. It was made possible by the exploitation of colonies. And there was no justification for keeping African living standards so depressed in an age where a higher standard was possible because of the work output by Africans themselves. So the only reason why a European could have a higher standard of living is because my black ass had to be colonized.
Like that's what it was built on.
Listen to this shit. In 1934, 41 Africans were killed in a gold mine disaster in the Gold Coast. And the capitalist company offered only 3 pounds. 3 pounds. 3 pounds to the dependents of each of these men as compensation.
3 pounds. 3 pounds.
So pretty much for the first portion of this chapter, he's speaking about the mining. He's speaking about the mining aspect of, you know, the mining that was happening in Africa right now at this point.
It was the work conditions were horrible. Like the hours that they had to work, the dangers. Obviously, after these people were killed, these Africans were killed. So this was a common occurrence based on the work conditions.
And to just to conclude what he was speaking about at this point, he says, in the final analysis, the shareholders of the mining companies were the ones who benefited most of all. They remained in Europe and North America and collected fabulous dividends every year from the gold, diamonds, manganese, uranium, etc., which were bought out of the South African subsoil by African labor. For years, the capitalist press itself praised Southern Africa as an investment outlet, returning super profits on capital invested. From the very beginning of the scramble for Africa, huge fortunes were made from gold and diamonds in Southern Africa by people like Cecil Rhodes. In the present century, both the investment and outflow of surplus have increased. Investment was mainly concentrated in mining and finance, where the profits were greatest. In the 1950s, British investments in South Africa was at an estimated 860 million pounds and yielded a stable profit of 15% or 129 pounds every year. Every year. Most mining companies had returns well over that average. De Beers Consolidated Mines made a profit that was both phenomenal and consistently high, between 26 million and 29 million throughout the 1950s. Congo was consistently a source of immense wealth for Europe, because from the time of colonization until 1906, King Leopold II of Belgium made at least 20 million from rubber and ivory. The period of mineral exploitation started quite early, then gained momentum after political control passed from King Leopold to the Belgian state in 1908. Total foreign capital inflow into the Congo between 1887 and 1953 was estimated by the Belgians to have been 5,700 million pounds. And we as African people, as Africans from Africa on the continent, did not see one motherfucking red cent. Nope. Not one. Not one. Not one. Mm-hmm. And y'all who got these Firestone tires.
Oh, wow.
From Firestone now. Firestone, listen to this shit.
Ooh-wee.
In 1926, the Firestone Rubber Company of the United States was able to acquire 1 million acres. 1 million acres. 1 million acres of forest land in Liberia at the cost of 6 cents per acre and 1% of the value of the exported rubber. Because of the demand for and the strategic importance of rubber, Firestone's profits from Liberia's land and labor carried them to 25th position among the giant companies of the United States.
And then if you go back a little bit before that, the land that they acquired and what they paid for it. It says on my page 154, their profits depended on the incredibly low wages and harsh working conditions imposed on African agricultural laborers, and on the fact they invested very little capital in obtaining the land, which was robbed wholesale from Africans by colonial power. So they didn't even have the power to sell their land for a reasonable price. And they sold to whites at nominal prices. For instance, after the Kenya Highlands had been declared crown land, the British handed over to Lord Delamere 100,000 acres of the best land for a cost of a penny per acre. A penny per acre. Lord Francis Scott purchased 350 acres. The East African states, I'm not sure what LTD stands for, got another 350 acres, and the East African Syndicate took 100,000 acres adjoining Lord Delamere's estate, all at giveaway prices. Needless to say, such plantations made huge profits if the rate was lower than that of a South African, even if the rate was lower than a South African gold mine or an Angolan diamond mine. So even the land that was sold, nothing was made in return for it, for the plantations that were erected. And this Mac Hidru stated in March 2008, a former French president, Jacques Chirac, said, "Without Africa, France will slide down into a rank of a third world power." Well, we know.
And that's because France right now in 2020 is still France's whole budget. We're talking about a country. Do you understand what it takes to run a country? Like how a country is able to sustain itself? France is able to exist right now because of the 14 so-called countries in Africa, which they steal from, which they still get colonial taxes from. Mm-hmm. 14 countries, and I say so-called countries because we understand that all of those so-called countries in Africa are imposed colonial borders.
Exactly.
But if they weren't stealing from these 14 countries, as the trapper just said in the comments, France will slide into the status of a third world country. So just think about that for a little while.
Thank you for that. And Alex says, for context of size, Rhode Island is about 988,832 acres. And then Valencia said that the Firestone paragraph was her read that back, and they've been trash. Mm-hmm. All of these companies have a stake in this.
Yeah. So mainly for the first part, he talks about the mining, and then he goes to talk about the African peasant. So these are pretty much our African brothers and sisters who were still working the land, meaning that they were growing their own crops and things of that nature. And to some extent, they were able to sell, the produce, the agriculture, products that they had been making. But now they're being introduced to these European trade companies who not only did they come into these areas and steal the products that they were making, that these African peasants were making, but they forced them to grow what the Europeans needed at this point. Mm-hmm. And he says, good examples of Africans literally being forced to grow cash crops, by gun and whip were to be found in Tanganyika under German rule in Portuguese colonies, in French Equatorial Africa, in the French Sudan in the 1930s. And it's like a little sub-note down here, and he says, these facts came most dramatically to the attention of the outside world when Africans resorted to violence. For example, forced cultivation of cotton was a major grievance behind the outbreak of Maji Wars in Tanganyika and behind the nationalist revolt in Angola as late as 1960. And he says, another example he uses y'all know in so-called Easter is getting ready to come up
Supposedly, yeah.
soon.
They say.
So he says sometimes the firms which purchase agriculture products in Africa were the same concerns which manufacture goods based on those agricultural raw materials. Y'all like them Cadbury eggs? The ones who make the chocolate Easter bunnies and all that shit? For instance, Cadbury and Fry, the two foremost English manufacturers of cocoa and chocolate, were buyers on the West African coast, while in East Africa, the tea manufacturing concern of Brook Bond both grew and exported tea.
And most chocolate producers today are not fair trade producers.
No, not at all.
And they use child African labor to produce that. Nestle, Hershey's, Mars, all of them.
All of them. All right, comrades.
I mean, this pissed me the fuck off.
Yeah, seriously.
It just did.
No shade.
And then even like really quickly, like even when they're so the surplus and everything that's going out, and the resources that are going out, then he talks about the necessities and what they needed to come back in. So like how those prices jump from, it says many necessities pass beyond the reach of the ordinary man. On the Gold Coast, a piece of cotton print which had sold before the war for 12.5 shillings was 90 shillings in 1945. In Nigeria, a yard of khaki, which was 3 shillings in pre-war days, went up to 16, and a bundle of iron sheets, formerly costing 30, went up to 100. So they couldn't even afford to get the things back that they had already sent out, and then now it's coming back in, and these are the prices that they're expected to pay for it. But you can't, because you're selling land and you know these things for cents on the dollar. And I just it is. It's so fucking disgusting, to the point where I don't understand how it's not more evident that this capital system that we have to survive in is just as predatory as it is.
You know, it's evident, like, you know, when you read history and you're able to be presented, you know, like with, you know, historical accounts like this, it's mind blowing, because you can't wrap your mind around like how any of this could happen. But even the reason why it's possible for you to even second guess that something like this could happen works and has worked in the interest of imperialism and capitalism and colonialism, because the white ruling class is not ignorant to what they have done to the rest of the world. They're not ignorant
at all. And
just like how we saw European missionaries, teachers, and, you know, all of these, even the neo-colonial sellouts that went into these African countries, not only the African countries, but, you know, into India, into China, into all of these different places, the so-called civilized, you know, the savages that lived there. Like, we see that same indoctrination happening through the educational system. Yes. We see it happening through media and different things like that. And imperialists have become geniuses of being able to muddle the history of how all of this shit has come into existence. And this is the type of work that we are involved in, which is, you know, taking the cover off of all of that shit. And it has to be done because, I mean, like, if you're talking about a system that came into being through the selling of other human beings, then you wouldn't be surprised that that same system could sell crack to your community, or that same system can poison the water of a community. That same system can employ pigs that shoot and kill colonized people with impunity. Like, you begin to understand that, it's not, it's the nature. It is the nature. It is the literal nature of imperialism to be this way. And we are literally, we are reading about how all of this shit came into being. Yeah.
So Alex said Nestle Fitness start the whole process over again, but with clean drinking water. And Raphael, we're reading How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. We just have two different versions of it. It's the same book.
All right, comrades. We're going to go ahead and get up out of here. But we've been on this book for a little minute now. So we have to wrap it up. So for our next reading assignment, we're going to finish chapter 5. We're going to finish chapter 5. We're going to finish chapter 5. And then the following Sunday, we're going to finish the rest of the book. We have to. And not only because we want to get through the book, but we have some very, very new, exciting developments coming up for the Revolutionary Book Trap that I won't announce now, but just remember that Black Hammer, we are an organization of colonized people. So we have to reach all nations, all sectors of the colonized proletariat. So, you might be seeing some new faces. You might be introduced to some new books. Who the hell knows? Who knows? But just stick around for more of my announcements about the development of the Revolutionary Book Trap podcast, the Propaganda podcast. And before we close, want to express appreciation to everybody who has donated to helping us get this new mic now that we have, that y'all can hear that crisp quality sound on.
Pretty soon Dean's gonna sing and record.
Absolutely none of this will be possible without your support, without your contribution. We as revolutionaries would be nothing without the people.
That's right.
Absolutely nothing. Thank you for believing in the revolution. Thank you for believing in Black Hammer. And thank you for believing that African and colonized people all around this world will be free. Yes. So y'all finish chapter 5, so we can go ahead and get through this book. Okay?
Yeah.
Until next time, trappers. Black power.
Black power, y'all.